From the questions about her real race to the royals' obsession with gossiping about the ton, these are the hidden truths in Queen Charlotte finally unveiled. While the show does dive deep into themes like race and identity, making it a thought-provoking watch, there's definitely a generous mix-up between history and fantasy, like the question of whether Queen Charlotte was really black. One of the major narratives in the show is how India Amartifio's Queen Charlotte navigates the challenges of being the first black queen of England, but in real life, there's been heavy debate over whether or not the royal was actually black. The character's based on the very real Princess Sophie Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, whose racial identity has been in question for the last several decades. The initial theories about her being black or mixed race began in the 1940s, when the Jamaican-American historian and journalist J.A. Rogers released his book and Race Volume 1. He claimed the facial features of the princess depicted in portraits, most notably her broad nostrils and heavy lips, indicate that she might have been part black. This fascinating theory was then revisited by another historian, Mario de Valdes, in 1997, in a publication for PBS Frontline, where he made a case that Charlotte was indeed black, and it all went back to her family tree. According to Valdes, Charlotte was a direct descendant of Margarida de Castro y Sousa, who came from a black offshoot of the Portuguese royal house. Now, Margarita's roots can be traced back all the way to the 15th century, about 9 generations away. Her ancestors were linked to some important historical figures, like 13th century ruler Afonso III and his lover, Madrigana. The interesting thing is that Valdes believes Madrigana might have been a Moor, which means she was probably a black African, linking us back to Charlotte's race through this intriguing ancestry. But not everyone's on board with this theory, as other historians doubt that this proves anything about Charlotte's race. Now, in Bridgerton's story, seeing the Queen as the first black female royal, the Crown starts handing out titles to other people of color and invites them to join the then segregated ton, which includes beloved Lady Agatha Danbury, who also becomes one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. It's meant to show support for Charlotte and reinforce the power of the Crown when setting practices for the court and its subjects. This whole instance is dubbed the Great Experiment. But when it comes to reality, did that ever really happen? Well, no. The Great Experiment never took place. In fact, nothing even comes close to its existence. But let's not forget the very first episode of Queen Charlotte, A Bridgerton Story, which opens up with a disclaimer from Lady Whistledown herself. In the monologue, she clearly states that this particular royal story is fiction inspired by fact, and that all liberties taken by the author are quite intentional. While the show definitely takes liberties in telling us about certain stories, like the epic romance between Queen Charlotte and her husband King George III, the characters themselves are actually inspired by real-life British monarchs. No doubt there were mixed race and black people in England during the time, but British society was still operating in an extremely segregated manner. Even in the Regency era, this would have been totally unrealistic. While slavery was abolished in 1807 in the British Empire, slaves weren't fully free until much later in 1838. So the Great Experiment did not benefit Queen Charlotte, since it was a total work of fiction. And while we're on the topic of fiction, Charlotte's brother Adolphus often lets something slip in German. But in the show, the Queen's German origins aren't exactly the center of focus. She never speaks German and talks with an English accent. But this couldn't be further from the truth. When she arrived in Britain, Queen Charlotte didn't speak a single word of English. But the show did get one thing right, that she had practically zero education about life at court, which is why the TV Charlotte also found it quite challenging to fit in. While the real Charlotte quickly learned English, she always spoke with a thick German accent. Luckily for her, her husband George III did know German, since both his father and grandfather grew up in Hanover, so they would have been able to communicate from the start. The Queen might not have brought an English education with her, but what she did bring was her love for Pomeranians. That's right. When Queen Charlotte traveled all the way to England to marry the king, she brought her 2 Pomeranians, Phoebe and Mercury. She loved the breed so much that she even gifted them to other members of the royal family. In the TV series, we see something totally different though. While George is trying to stay away from Charlotte, he's gently steered towards sending her a gift, and he ends up giving her a Pomeranian, a gift that he hoped would make her feel a little less lonely. It takes young Charlotte a while to warm up to the dog, but we later see the adult Charlotte always accompanied by a band of her furry little friends. This couldn't be more wrong. and she's far from being the only royal to have a special love for dogs. Elizabeth II was also quite well known for her love of corgis, and Charlotte's son King George IV and her granddaughter Queen Victoria also became famous Pomeranian lovers in later decades. Queen Victoria even started a breeding program, keeping them as constant companions, often traveling with them and relying on them for comfort after Prince Albert's passing. In addition to her love for dogs, Queen Charlotte famously had a snuff addiction, which was also highlighted on the show. She didn't earn the nickname Snuffy Charlotte for nothing. The royal kept a dedicated room filled with ground tobacco at Windsor Castle, and she'd collected a whopping 90 snuff boxes by the time of her death in 1818. She loved the dry, aged, ground tobacco, and she even had her own face adorned on the snuff boxes she collected. According to a history site, those cool snuff boxes were a definition of status and fashion and could easily compare to having the latest mobile phone in the early 21st century. Looks like our sassy queen was way ahead of her time, with an entire room at Windsor being dedicated to her snuff stuff. The queen claimed the tobacco was a means of curing her frequent headaches, and she even had a favorite blend, Violet Strasbourg, which was a mix of bitter almond attar and ambergris. She took the stuff with a spoonful of green tea every morning like clockwork. Maybe that's what kept her healthy enough to bear more than a dozen children. Despite getting married within 6 hours of meeting each other, and the marriage primarily being a political alliance, George and Charlotte were happily married for nearly 60 years, and they had a whopping 15 children together. 13 of those children survived, and most were born at Buckingham Palace, after Charlotte changed the royal family's residence from St. James's Palace to Buckingham Palace. With 15 royal heirs to the throne, there was a whole army of servants, tutors, and nurses to serve them. It's incredible how Charlotte managed to juggle motherhood and carry out her royal duties, but seeing how her children's descendants played crucial roles in the world we know today, I guess she did a pretty good job at both. The Queen Charlotte that we saw in Bridgerton is obsessed with gossip, loves her over-the-top wigs and outfits, and is always surrounded by her entourage. Some of this is for sure based on reality, like the Queen loving her gossip. While we don't have confirmation of whether she regularly read a gossip column about her people, published by a teenager pretending to be a woman, we do know that the real Queen Charlotte was heavily involved in the matchmaking season. Her husband established the first debutante ball in her honor, and the tradition lasted for several decades after, until Queen Elizabeth II canceled them sometime in the 1950s. Even after her husband descended into madness, Charlotte would write letters to George telling him about all the latest gossip around the ton. The letters didn't stop even when they were apart, often signing them "Your very affectionate friend and wife, Charlotte." Adorable. And the next time you need a lesson or two in historical romance, many of these letters can still be found and read in the royal archives today. The friendship between them likely suffered when the king got mentally ill, but Charlotte never turned her back on him. Up until her death in 1818, she remained her husband's loyal guardian. So there you have it. From the royal's obsession with gossiping about the ton to the questions about her real race, those were the hidden truths in Queen Charlotte finally unveiled.